Welcome back, everybody, to Eat the Rich. My name is Chris, and it's just going to be us for this one. I wanted to put this episode together and talk a little bit more about what we saw last weekend in Houston, where 9 concertgoers died in a crowd crush at the Astroworld Festival. And this is a topic I'm by no means an expert on, but, live music is something that has always meant a lot to me, and I've put a lot of thought into crowd safety and stuff like that, and this has been something of an area of interest for me personally for a while now. And I wanted to do this episode because there's a lot of misconception about what happened at Astroworld, and just with the concept of crowd crushes generally. It's not something that is very well understood, generally even by event organizers. Even by the very people responsible for safely moving a large crowd of people in and out of a venue. Even though there's been plenty of academic study on crowd dynamics, and there's a very clear understanding of the dangers that crowd density can present, even though there are effective methods that event organizers can use to identify potential trouble spots and actions, often very simple actions that can be taken to mitigate the risk. And these are very often neglected entirely by Live Nation and by these event organizers. And the past week, since the tragedy, has followed a very familiar pattern to anyone who's looked into this kind of thing before. Because in the vast majority of crowd crush incidents, the event organizers are the ones that are to blame, often with police negligence being another significant contributing factor. And yet, in the vast majority of these incidents, the crowd itself is blamed, often by the event organizers and by police, with the help from the media in amplifying their side of the story. So, like from Astroworld, we get this ludicrous a cartoon-like fantasy of some maniac like running through the crowd injecting people with drugs being offered as an explanation. And it originated with the Astroworld security staff, supposedly. It was repeated totally uncritically by the Houston police, by the chief of the Houston police, and then amplified by TMZ and other unscrupulous media outlets. And 4 days later, the Houston police issued a correction saying that, well, that never actually happened. The security guard who had been injected, well, actually, he was not injected at all. He'd been punched. It was bad info, our bad, you know what I'm saying? Bad info that it took them 4 days to correct after saying it on TV. Never mind that the police chief also said that medical staff had seen the injection site on his neck and revived him with Narcan, a complete fabrication. And by the way, TMZ tweeted about this before the police press conference, saying that a source connected to Astroworld had told them about it. So it looks awfully suspicious that this same false story is given directly to both the police and the media. By the way, that TMZ article is still up. They haven't retracted it or issued a correction. But even when the media isn't willingly participating in the cover-up, as I suspect that TMZ is, often the coverage of these kind of events is really inaccurate in the picture it paints of what happened. And it can help fuel the misconceptions that people have and perpetuate this victim blaming. The biggest criticism I have there with some of the media coverage is with the use of the word stampede, which you will see over and over and over again in headlines about things like this. It's not at all an accurate word to describe what happens. A stampede tends to evoke images of like a panicked herd, like animals, like running, maybe acting irrationally, trampling over each other carelessly and killing each other. But that's not right at all. In fact, it's more the opposite of that. What happened in Astroworld and what happens in these kind of situations is the crowd is so condensed that running is impossible. In many cases, lifting your arms is impossible. You're so compressed by the force of the people around you pressing against you that your chest can't expand to breathe, and you die of asphyxiation. And many people who die in these kind of situations die standing up. They're not being trampled underfoot. Many of them don't have any outward signs of trauma, no visible injuries, no blood. In many cases, the crowd is totally calm right up until the moment that the crush begins. And the panic that ensues among the crowd is not the cause of the death, but a reaction to this, very dangerous situation that people suddenly find themselves in. And you're in the middle of it, and by the time you start panicking, there's not really much of anything you can do. You can't run. You can't run and trample people. You can't move at all on your own volition. And the language that we use is important. And I think that to call it a stampede does a great disservice to the victims, because it implies that it was the actions of other people in the crowd that killed them, or worse, that it was their own fault. And ultimately, what all of this does is help to shield the people who are actually responsible from being held accountable. So what I wanted to do in this episode is go over a few other crowd crush incidents to illustrate how they happen, why they happen, who's at fault, and how in the United States justice is pretty hard to come by for victims of these tragedies due to a lack of any kind of understanding of the science of crowd dynamics in common law jurisprudence, and because the victims often find themselves in court facing someone like Live Nation or Walmart or some other massive corporation that can throw unlimited money at their legal defense, and it's very hard for victims to get any kind of justice. And at the end of the episode, we're going to circle back around to Astroworld and take a look specifically at Live Nation and their history of negligence. This is not by any means the first time that their negligence has caused people to die. There are also repeated OSHA violations, history of unfair labor practices, and also just more generally how awful they are for the events the events industry generally. How much they are have become a monopoly, and the way they're also cutting into artists' ability to make money off of these live shows because of the a change in the payment structure last year that really takes a lot of the profits that musicians would have had from selling merchandise and from playing live shows, because that is the live concerts and merchandise are the main moneymakers if you're a musician nowadays. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit more about crowds and what exactly it is that can make them dangerous. You've been in them, I've been in them. A common part of life. They don't often feel dangerous, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, like if you're packed in real tight on the floor at an arena during a concert, or if you're at Penn Station or like somewhere going down the escalator to get to your train. We've all been in densely packed crowds. Completely normal experience, common, happens all the time, and most of the time everything ends up fine. However, anytime you have a very dense crowd of people, it doesn't even have to be a particularly large crowd, just dense. There does exist the potential for danger. Crowd-related injuries happen all the time, and they're becoming more common. Injuries and deaths occur in a wide range of situations: concerts, sporting events, funerals, nightclubs, train stations, Black Friday sales, religious pilgrimages. And sometimes they happen because of some perceived threat in the crowd that a large number of people all try to move away from at once. For instance, at the E2 nightclub in Chicago in 2003, there was a fight on the dance floor. This is the club is on the second floor of this building, and the security guard, in an attempt to break up this fight, sprays pepper spray at them inside the building. There's over 1,100 people crowded in this room. The fumes, linger in this cramped space. People start being affected by the pepper spray. People begin vomiting and fainting, and then everyone starts to try to make their way out of the building. Well, the club had 3 exits. One of them was obstructed. One of them was locked. So everyone has to try to attempt to exit through a single door at the bottom of a staircase on the first floor. And the door open inward, which is obviously a fire code violation, specifically for these kind of situations. So when everybody's trying to exit down the stairs, some people get trapped up against this door. Others, towards the front of the crowd, trip and fall, and people begin to pile up at the bottom of the stairs. By the end of it, 21 people are dead and 50 are injured. The investigation that happened after this determined that the club's owners, there's 2 of them, were guilty of 11 building code violations. The inward opening door that I mentioned, the obstructing the other 2 exits, exceeding maximum occupancy, faulty exit sign lighting. Ultimately, they were acquitted of all involuntary manslaughter charges, and they were sentenced to just 2 years in prison on a single count of criminal contempt just for the code violations. Crowd crushes can also be a significant factor in building fires. Actually, just 3 days after the incident at E2 was the fire at the Station nightclub in Rhode Island during the Great White Concert. Pyrotechnics were set off by the band's tour manager. They ignited the foam insulation in the walls and the ceilings above the stage. Everyone starts heading towards the exit. The Station nightclub had 4 exits. 2 of them were chained shut. One of them was literally right next to the stage, in the room where the fire started. But initially, the bouncer wouldn't let concert goers use it because it was the band's exit. So everybody is herded towards, everybody's pushed towards trying to exit through the front door, which is at the end of a very narrow hallway. And, this is where the crowd crush happens there. The fire, the death toll from the fire being exacerbated by the fact that these people don't have the ability to get out the door. So out of 400 people that were there that night, 100 died and 200 were injured. And 58 of those people who died were in the area directly around that front hallway. So, you're probably beginning to see the specific ways in which, negligence on the part of the club owners or the promoters or the event planners, and failing to plan for these kind of contingencies, failing to plan for emergency situations, results in all of these people dying. One of the experts on crowd dynamics is a guy named Dr. Keith Still. He's got a slideshow presentation on YouTube. And if you've read any articles about this, you've probably seen his name because he's one of the people that they talk to over and over again. But he has this slideshow presentation on YouTube. It's about a half hour long about this type of stuff, where he goes very deeply into the science of it, and also offers the kinds of things that people can do to plan and try to prevent these types of situations. But in this presentation, he points out the way in which people's conditional bias prevents them from recognizing or taking steps to prevent these kind of tragedies. Like if you own a nightclub, or if you're Live Nation, or if you're producing a large music festival or something like that, and it's something that you've done many, many, many times. You've been responsible for large crowds, perhaps hundreds of times, and nothing's ever gone wrong. And if that's the case, you're likely to just continue thinking that nothing ever will go wrong. And because of that, you can ignore potential problems or warning signs. You've done it successfully so many times that you're just unable to even perceive the threat that might exist there. And crowd dynamics is something that's poorly understood, and crowd-related injuries are vastly underreported. In the United States, especially, there's no sort of standard. Like there's no sort of there's nothing that makes you have to, as an event organizer or a nightclub owner or something like that. There's nothing that requires you to do this kind of work to analyze crowd flows and to try to identify problem areas and take action to prevent these kind of things from happening. And for every event that results in death or injury, there are hundreds more near misses, right? There are hundreds more other situations that are close calls. You're just right at the tipping point of having a disaster within a crowd, but it doesn't happen. And because of that, when these things happen, there's nobody taking note of them. There's nobody analyzing these kinds of situations and saying, well, this was almost really bad. What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again? And you can see, these types of things happen all the time. There's actually on YouTube, there's a video that was taken at Penn Station in New York, and it's just a few years back, and it's taken on one of the escalators heading down to the train platform for the New Jersey Transit, and you have this very densely packed group of people trying to get through this doorway at the bottom of the escalator, and something is obstructing their way, and nobody's moving. And the escalator is continuing to bring new people who are unaware of what's going on down into the crowd because there's no place to go. And it doesn't appear that anybody is injured in this, at least not seriously. But there is this moment of genuine fear and panic, and people screaming about the situation, where they, all of a sudden realize just what a potentially dangerous situation they're in. And nobody's recording this. Nobody's analyzing this. Nobody's sharing this kind of information, especially at large concerts. These kinds of near misses happen with some regularity. These kind of potentially dangerous crowd-related situations happen often, and it's largely ignored until something really bad happens. The events industry doesn't require any kind of formal qualifications. Anybody can set themselves up as an event organizer, get a permit, and then be in charge of thousands of people's lives. There's no engineering standard for the events industry, for the way you're supposed to move large groups of people around. Everybody's basically just winging it and hoping for the best. And, like I said, the more times you get away with it, the less likelihood there is for you to perceive the underlying risk. And because, making the necessary safety improvements is something that's going to cost them money, they're resistant to doing it. They have no incentive to. And most crowd-related deaths aren't caused by, the kind of situations I just mentioned, by the crowd moving away from a perceived threat. There's two primary kinds of crowd movements that lead to these kinds of situations. Flight is the one we just talked about, where the crowd suddenly begins to flee from something, from some kind of threat. The other one is what is called a craze. Not crazy about that term either. To me, that word seems to imply that the crowd is behaving irrationally, but they're not. That's not the case. What they call a craze is when the crowd is all at once moving in the direction of something they want, like with the rational expectation that they're going to get something that they desire by doing so. Close proximity to the stage, Black Friday sales, Rick and Morty fucking Polynesian sauce. I don't know. It can be anything. And these are the cases where the crowd can be calm and happy and everything is totally normal. But when you get to around 4 or 5 people per square meter, like when you get around to that density, that's when you begin to get into the danger zone. And crowds of 4 or 5 people per square meter are not uncommon. In a crowded elevator or a subway car, it's totally not uncommon to be in a crowd of 4 or 5 people. It's not necessarily dangerous yet. It's situational. It can creep up on you. By the time you get to 6 people per square meter, there's no space left between individuals, and you begin to lose the ability to move on your own. By 7 people per square meter, the crowd is essentially one solid mass. At this point, the laws of fluid dynamics apply at densities this high. In other words, like if somebody pushes or stumbles in the crowd, it sends a shockwave through. And you can, if you watch some of the video from the crowd at the Love Parade in 2010, very harrowing footage, you can see this. It's shot from above the crowd, and you can see these ripples moving throughout the crowd. And this is people, being moved against their will, sometimes maybe 10 feet in one direction, 10 feet in the other direction. At this point, you've lost all personal autonomy. Some people are lifted out of their shoes or have their clothes torn off. If somebody falls in this kind of situation, the pressure of the crowd pushes the people immediately next to them into the void created, right? So this then leads to like a chain reaction that pushes many people, more and more people down on top of them. And, while this could be happening, the people further back in the crowd may have no idea and continue moving into it. When a large group of people are all moving in one direction, the group is sort of propelling itself with its own momentum. So if you're 100 feet away, or maybe even 10 feet away, you could be totally unaware that people are suffocating and dying and just continue walking into it. And even if you wanted to stop, you may not even be able to because of the momentum of the people behind you. And this can be worsened by, let's say, like a cop or a security guard continuing to, direct people into an area that could be, the situation may be on the other side of a door or through a tunnel, right? And you're being directed by event staff to continue going down this tunnel towards this very high density, very dangerously high density crowd, and you're totally unaware as you keep moving into it. Or like the example I mentioned of the one at Penn Station, it could be something like an escalator, continuing to move new people into the crowd. A lot of times these things can happen in a very tight turn, like a right angle turn in a hallway. Is a place where these kind of things can commonly happen. And the people who are, they're continuing to move into it, if they knew what was going on, surely if they could, they would try to step back and relieve the pressure. But even if they're able to do that, they just lack the information to know that that's what they should do, and they continue moving into it. And this is how most of these things happen. The crowd itself has no idea what's going on until it's too late. They're simply moving through, the pathways designated by the event organizers, perhaps directed by event staff or police. In most of the large crowd crush incidents of the last few decades, this is how it's happened. It wasn't, it wasn't a fire or gunshots or, something caused a panic in the crowd and people try to flee. That's not how these mostly happen. It was an issue of design. It was a failure on the part of the event organizers to analyze crowd flows and identify the potential trouble spots and take the necessary steps to protect people's lives. Again, this would cost them money. They have no incentive to do it. Nobody's making them do it, and it's just going to cost them money to do it. So that's why it doesn't get done. And time after time, it's the same common failures and underlying features that could have been identified and addressed. You can calculate crowd flow and what the safe crowd capacity would be. You can set a limit to it. You can identify potentially dangerous bottlenecks, and you can have staff stationed far enough upstream from it, taking account of how many people are entering. There's many things that you can do to try to mitigate the risk. And there's no contingency plans for something like this at many events. They may have planned for something like, how people will be evacuated in a fire, or if there's an active shooter or something like that, but they haven't planned for this. Very often, they haven't even identified the kind of locations where, where there could be problems. And there's standard risk assessment models that can be applied to any kind of situation where you're moving a large crowd of people around. And if you're interested, I'll put in the episode description, I'll put that YouTube slideshow by Keith Still that I mentioned earlier. If you're interested, you can take a look at what I'm mentioning, these kind of risk assessment models. They're talked about in a lot more detail. The science is there. I mean, people in this field have a very clear understanding of how and why these things happen and how to prevent them. The tools exist that can prevent this from happening, but they're ignored. Due to just sheer greed or negligence or both. And I just wanted to provide a few more examples here real quick. And I'm sorry, I know this stuff is very grim. But I mentioned the Love Parade earlier. It was a music festival in Germany. It was annual. And in 2010, in order to prevent people from sneaking in, they had this one entrance. And it was like down a street that had these, very steep, sheer walls going up at least like 50 feet or so on either side of it, like kind of like a canyon, right? And this is the one main entrance and exit for the entire music festival. And so, imagine like a T-shaped intersection. At the end of this, main entry channel, which is going north-south, there it's intersected by a pedestrian bridge going east-west, right? And so what happens in the east-west parts of the T, these pedestrian bridges, this is what's bringing more people into the festival. And so what ends up happening At some point, in order to supposedly allow an emergency vehicle to pass, the police began cordoning off these pathways. And for some ridiculous reason that I don't think has ever been adequately explained, they set up 3 police cordons, one on each of these east-west pedestrian bridges that's stopping, the flow of new people from coming in, and then another one in this concrete channel that I mentioned that's leading into the festival, stopping people from coming out. And they hold it like this for like 20 minutes. To the point where they have extremely large crowds gathered at each police cordon, waiting to get past, waiting to get in and out. And then, when they dissolve these police lines and let everybody pass, now you have thousands of people all converging on this concrete channel. Some of them trying to get in, some of them trying to go the complete opposite direction and get out, and you have this enormous crowd, then crushed in this one area. Ultimately, 21 people died as a result of this, and at least 500 were injured. And ultimately, what this comes down to is poor event planning and police negligence. At Hillsborough Stadium in England in 1989, another example of this, police opened an emergency exit as this is like at the start of the game. The fans are still trying to get into the stadium. Because of the rivalry between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, the event organizers segregated the crowd into separate entrances on separate sides of the stadium. And because they tried to do it that way, they weren't utilizing all of the other entrances on the other parts of the building. So they're trying to get way too many people through too few entryways. And what ends up happening is you have this very large crowd of people impatient trying to get inside. One of the police officers decides to open this, because the people have to enter through this turnstile, and it slows the entry of people coming in. It slows it down. So this police officer opens this emergency exit and allows the crowd to, allows thousands of Liverpool fans to, go down this tunnel to this standing room only pen that is already at capacity. And, 97 people died as a result of that, 766 injured. During the crush, people were trying to climb the fence and escape, but the police fought to keep them contained, thinking that they were trying to rush the field. After this happened, the police falsified field reports. The police blamed the crowd. They planted fake stories in the press about the behavior of the crowd at the game. The media went along with it, blamed hooliganism. And for many years, the crowd was blamed for causing this to happen, when, again, it was poor planning on the part of the event organizers and negligence on the part of the police. Also, at Mecca during the Hajj, thousands of people over the years have died during Hajj, which is, one of the largest gatherings of people anywhere on earth when it happens, and incredibly important if you're a Muslim. Unfortunately, when you go, your life is in the hands of this, inbred, bloodthirsty royal family that cares more about, oil and carpet bombing Yemen than they do about ensuring the safety of pilgrims. In 1990, 1,426 people died in a pedestrian tunnel leading from Mecca back to the camps at Mina, where people stay when they're there on the pilgrimage. And every few years since then, another few hundred people die in these kind of situations, usually in the same locations, on the way into or out of the camps at Mina. And so finally, the Saudis invested a bunch of money into building new pedestrian bridges, that lead from the camps to Mecca. And but in 2015, after they've already built these bridges, Saudi security forces, who were in charge of managing the crowd, allowed 2 large crowds of pilgrims coming from opposite directions to converge on the same bridge. The Saudi government they failed to adequately investigate this. They've yet to release any kind of official report. They said originally, after it happened, that the death toll was 769, and they've never updated that figure. more accurate estimates that were pieced together by other countries based on the number of missing people that they had after the Hajj puts the toll more in the range of at least over 2,000 to 2,500. And the Saudis have never taken any responsibility for any of these. And any time they happen, in fact, they say that it was God's will. It was just God's will that it happened. Now, what happens if you live in the United States and you're a victim of a crowd-related disaster? Maybe you were in the crowd and you were injured. Maybe you're a family member of someone who was killed. The United States has an unusually high number of crowd-related incidents. Many other countries have taken some of these steps towards requiring events organizers to do the kind of work needed to help identify and mitigate risk. But the United States has not. And 37% of concert-related injuries worldwide happen in the United States. So let's say you're a victim of one of these, and you're trying to get some kind of justice from the people responsible for it. Well, it's not easy. And despite the growing number of crowd-related injuries and deaths in the United States, there have been virtually no legislative steps taken to address it. So common law remains the only source of law with regard to crowd crush, and it's deeply flawed in its analysis. So for this next part, and again, I'll also have a link to this in the episode description. A lot of this section was taken directly from a 2015 article in the Kentucky Law Journal by Tracy Pearl. And the title of it is Crowd Crush, How the Law Leaves American Crowds Unprotected. And just for a moment here, I'm going to read directly from it. It says, despite the frequency with which crowd crush injuries occur, the jurisprudence surrounding liability for these injuries is remarkably sparse and inconsistent. Even though crowd crush cases date back to the early 1930s, courts have largely failed to establish a body of legal standards or even guidelines to assist in assessing liability in these cases. Instead, courts have taken a mostly ad hoc approach to crowd crush cases, using a combination of conventional wisdom about crowds and general principles of tort law to rule on liability. Courts have also almost entirely ignored the body of science that has emerged in recent decades to predict and explain crowd dynamics and management. The law's underdevelopment in crowd crush cases, though problematic for the reasons discussed herein, is not particularly surprising for several reasons. First, as discussed above, crowd crush injuries are severely underreported. Additionally, only a small percentage of the crowd injuries that are in fact reported result in litigation, and the vast majority of the few cases that are brought settle, leaving only a small handful of opportunities for courts to develop the common law jurisprudence in this area. Second, there are virtually no statutory laws to guide courts in these cases. Only one state has passed any law pertaining to crowd management and safety. These two factors make crowd crush litigation unpredictable and arguably unappealing to potential plaintiffs who, at least in the case of concert-related crowd crush injuries, are usually faced with defendants who are media behemoths that can spend lavishly to defend their policies. These obstacles, in turn, perpetuate the weakness and inconsistency of the jurisprudence in this area. Potential plaintiffs are often deterred from filing suit, and those that do file suit feel pressured to settle because of the unpredictability of litigation in this area. So courts miss the opportunity to establish guiding precedent. As a result of this situation, the common law jurisprudence surrounding crowd crush is a veritable mixed bag of standards and rulings. Cases dating back to the 1940s and earlier are often the only published decisions relating to crowd-related injuries in many jurisdictions. Thus, many decisions that we would now find problematic from a scientific perspective are still binding precedent. Moreover, courts are currently split on, among other critical legal issues, whether crowd crushes are foreseeable, whether the acts of individual crowd members are intervening, superseding causes of plaintiffs' injuries, and whether individuals assume the risk of injury when they enter a crowd. Crowd science arguably provides extremely clear and straightforward answers to these questions in most cases, and yet, this body of science has been almost entirely overlooked by courts in the United States. I'm going to go ahead now and give a few examples of this that highlight some of the common problems. One of the errors that courts make is a misplaced reliance on capacity numbers. Like I mentioned earlier, like I mentioned in the beginning, the crown doesn't necessarily have to be particularly large. It just has to be dense. But in a lot of these cases, the court is essentially saying that the only responsibility that the venue has is to keep the space from exceeding its maximum capacity. And even if they haven't done that, then they can't be held responsible. So I'm going to read a little bit back from that Kentucky Law Journal article, just briefly, two particular cases that illustrate this. One of them is called Lazarus v. Shores Theater Corp. It says here, the plaintiff was injured when she collided with another patron in the inner lobby of a movie theater. The court unanimously reversed the judgment for the plaintiff in a one-paragraph decision, noting that the highest estimate given during the trial, one that was patently excessive, was that the theater was filled to half its capacity. The court found that the fact that the theater had not been filled to its official capacity meant that the lobby could not have been dangerously crowded, and thus the defendant couldn't have been negligent. Similarly, in Schwartz versus Madison Square Garden Corp., the court found that there was no evidence of breach, this is a breach of their duty of care, in a crowd crush case because the records of the defendant showed that the balcony of Madison Square Garden, where the injury had occurred, had a maximum capacity of 5,867 people. And on the day that the plaintiff was injured, was at 761 under that maximum. And this logic is flawed fundamentally. To say that if the venue was not at its maximum capacity, then therefore the owners or the managers or even the event organizers can't be negligent because they hadn't exceeded maximum occupancy. And this relies on the assumption that people are going to distribute themselves evenly throughout the space, which obviously isn't true. Crowds are going to tend to push forward and assemble tightly around locations of value within the venue. It could be the main stage, it could be the bathrooms, the beer line, the merch table. And these high-risk crowd densities can develop within a smaller area of the venue when the venue itself isn't filled to capacity. If you have an area where a portion of the crowd is forced to, negotiate some kind of bottleneck, a location that could easily have been properly identified and steps taken to mitigate the risk, it doesn't matter if the venue is only half full. But the events organizers can simply say, well, the venue was only half at capacity, and our duty of care was just to ensure that the venue was not filled past its designated capacity, and that's where our responsibility ends. And almost unanimously, American courts have gone along with this. Another consistent flaw in American courts in these kinds of cases is an over-reliance on building code compliance. Was the venue up to code? Well, it doesn't really matter because there's no requirements in building codes about moving large groups of people through an area. A space can be properly and adequately constructed and totally up to code and still contain these bottlenecks and deficiencies in the way the space is arranged that are only going to arise when a large group of people try to utilize that space. And reading just a little bit more now from the Kentucky Law Journal article, this is going to give an example, specifically of a case like that. In October 1993, Crowd Crush at Camp Randall Stadium in Madison, Wisconsin, highlights the limited relevance of building code compliance in assessing breach. Again, that's breach of duty of care on the part of the venue operator or producer. On October 30th, 1993, the University of Wisconsin football team defeated its longtime conference opponent, the University of Michigan, before a sellout crowd of 77,000 spectators, and became a possible Rose Bowl contender for that season. That victory prompted the crowd crush disaster that came next. The New York Times reported, here's an excerpt from the contemporary New York Times story. As the game ended, thousands of jubilant spectators in the Wisconsin student section behind one of the end zones began pouring out of the stands, where they confronted a chain-link fence designed to keep fans off the playing field. The fence was only several feet high, and the students could have easily vaulted it if they were not held back by security officers and Madison police. But because the students were initially restrained behind the fence, a crush began to build up that rippled back into the stands. And by the end of the incident, the force of which had twisted metal railings and bent fences, 3 people were critically injured, 5 were seriously hurt, and more than 70 were taken to the hospital. The post-crush investigation assessed, among other issues, whether the stadium complied with relevant building codes. The investigation revealed that the stadium was inspected by the Madison Fire Department twice a year and had been inspected 3 months prior to the crowd crush. That inspection revealed only minor violations relating to blocked aisles within the stadium's interior, violations that seemingly had little to do with the incident. A court would err, however, if it had concluded from the lack of major violations that the stadium owners could not have possibly have breached their duty of care with regard to crowd control because their facility complied with relevant building codes. Indeed, the two have little to do with one another. The biannual inspections of the stadium were conducted when the facility was empty and were based on building code requirements that had been written in the 1970s. Little or no attention to crowd management issues seems to have been paid by the inspectors, even though there were physical characteristics of the facility that should have raised crowd injury concerns. The stadium's egress capabilities were poor. While there were 4 exits, only 2 exits were available for fans to use, and those exits were a mere 8 feet and 9.5 feet in width. The code compliance of Camp Randall Stadium thus had little bearing on whether the stadium's owners had taken reasonable precautions to prevent crowd injuries at their facility. As 2 legal scholars assert, even if there had been small or even moderate building code violations at the stadium, any possible code violation would be only a minor issue when a crowd is surging uncontrollably down the stands. With a sold-out crowd of well over 75,000 people, reasonable crowd management at Camp Randall Stadium arguably demanded significantly more than mere compliance with building codes. Another issue is the emphasis that both courts and venue owners put on the demographic characteristics of the crowd, as if that itself can be a predictor of crowd-related incidents. And one last brief excerpt here from the Kentucky Law Journal article. It says, in Heenan versus Comcast Spectator and Spectrum Arena Limited Partnership, the court was tasked with reviewing a jury decision that found venue owners liable for crowd crush injuries that occurred at a Philadelphia arena after a Guns N' Roses concert was unexpectedly canceled after the crowd had already been seated. As the plaintiff attempted to exit the arena after the cancellation, the crowd grew dense around her, and in the resulting confusion, she fell and sustained a number of injuries. In assessing whether the jury could have reasonably found the plaintiff's injuries were foreseeable, the court noted that it was not merely a dense crowd during the relevant incident, it was a crowd of, quote, nearly 14,000 Guns N' Roses fans, all disappointed, some angry, and some violent. While the court did not explicitly state what was to be inferred from the fact that the crowd members were Guns N' Roses fans, it noted later in the opinion that this was a, quote, hard rock crowd which required additional security even under normal circumstances, and thus that venue owners had advance warning that, quote, this particular crowd could be problematic. And this brings us back to Astroworld, because this is exactly the type of thing that we're seeing right now, blaming the demographic characteristics of the crowd. Among the footage that's been shown over and over again about this is of the entrance to the VIP section being overrun by people, gate crashers sneaking into the festival. Even though this is something that happened several hours before the crowd crush started, and even though the fact that it happened at all is itself an example of the failure of the event organizers to safely manage the crowd, it's used to place blame on the crowd, right? That they were rowdy, that they were lawless, that this is, somehow their fault. And these kinds of things can happen in any kind of crowd. It could be a Travis Scott concert or a tennis match or an opera or a religious festival. The demographics of the crowd are not a significant contributing factor to these kinds of incidents. So who's responsible for what happened at Astroworld? Well, Satan. Obviously, it's Satan. It was a sacrifice to Moloch. He desires blood. Sometimes the Illuminati needs to do these kinds of things occasionally. God is real, and demons walk the earth. No, Live Nation. Obviously, Live Nation is responsible. And if you're not totally familiar with Live Nation, it's the largest concert events managing company in North America, probably in the world. In 2019, they reported $11.5 billion in revenue. They have, over the last 16 years, quietly amassed nearly a monopoly on the live entertainment industry. They merged with Ticketmaster in 2010. So since then, they essentially control every level of an event, from producing the show to ticketing. Also over the last decade or so, they've bought up hundreds of venues, from small clubs to theaters to large arenas and amphitheaters. Especially, last year, since the pandemic started, as many smaller, independent venues have struggled to stay afloat. Live Nation has been going around scooping all of these up left and right and cornering even more of this market. And many artists would prefer not to work with Live Nation at all. But if you're a touring band in the United States, it's nearly impossible. Even if you don't want to work with a producer, even if you were to say, well, fuck it, well, fuck Live Nation, I don't need them. I'm going to contact the venue myself and set this up and produce this show. Well, if you're a touring band in the United States, like I mentioned, Live Nation owns hundreds and hundreds of venues. So working with them at some point on the tour is pretty much inevitable. And this working relationship between artists and Live Nation has gotten much worse in the past year as well. Obviously, in 2020, there weren't a whole lot of concerts at all due to the pandemic. And this lack of revenue that Live Nation saw was then passed on to the artists. So, ahead of concerts resuming in 2021, Live Nation reconstructed the agreement that they'd had with artists about the way profits are split up. They decreased the artist guaranteed fee by 20%. And this is even for existing agreements that they may have already had. Like, let's say the show was already planned in 2020, but then the pandemic hits and it has to be canceled and rescheduled. The guarantee for the artist fee that artist is going to get for the 2021 show is going to be 20% less than what was already agreed upon in 2020. In addition, ticket prices for shows that Live Nation produces are at their sole discretion. Also, if the concert is canceled due to poor ticket sales, the artist now gets just 25% of their guarantee, whereas previously they still got their full 100%. If an artist happens to be the one that cancels the performance for any reason at all, they have to pay Live Nation twice their artist fee. So in other words, the fee that Live Nation would have paid them if they'd done the show, if the artist cancels for any reason at all, they have to pay twice that fee back to Live Nation. Live Nation now also takes a cut of 30% of any merchandise sold at the concert. They've passed along the cost of insurance for the band to the band, which used to be provided by the promoter. Now the band is 100% responsible for it. And the timing of all of this is particularly egregious because it wasn't just Live Nation that took a huge hit to their revenue in 2020. So did all the artists. And Live Nation, who again made $11.5 billion in 2019, is passing this burden on to the artists who may already be struggling themselves. People don't buy albums anymore. Everybody has a streaming service, right? The main source of income for a lot of these artists, especially not the huge ones, like the ones who may be kind of playing like clubs and theaters and stuff like that. This may be their main source of income, is touring and merchandise. And because Live Nation essentially has a monopoly on this, they're able to, dip their grubby little fingers into more and more areas and divert, significant chunks of this income that used to go directly to the artists. And I think it's worth considering as well. I'm going to speculate a little bit here, but at a time when Live Nation is doing all of this kind of grimy shit to cut costs, could this have contributed to what happened in Houston? Did they, even more than normal, neglect safety concerns? Did they cut corners to reduce their costs? I wouldn't be surprised at all if we find out that they did. And also, this is by no means the first time that Live Nation has killed people with their negligence. In 2012, a crew member for Radiohead died after a stage collapse in Ontario. Live Nation was charged with serious violations of health and safety laws. 7 people were killed and 61 were injured in another stage collapse in 2011 at the Indiana State Fair. The Houston Chronicle recently linked Live Nation to at least 750 injuries and 200 deaths at events since 2006, based on a search of court records. They faced numerous lawsuits over the years for this type of stuff. Between 2016 and 2019, they were cited for 10 OSHA violations and fined. A lot of the times, the staff that is hired by Live Nation to work at these concerts are they don't go through traditional staffing agencies a lot of times and get experienced people. These are non-union, independent contractors. They can pay them $10 an hour. They give them no benefits. A lot of them are totally inexperienced and unqualified to be doing the sometimes dangerous jobs that they're required to do. And they can be put in these situations where they're responsible not just for their own lives, but the lives of the crowd as well. And Live Nation takes no steps at all to train these people in crowd safety. Live Nation has been the subject of class action lawsuits about failing to provide employees with breaks and overtime pay. Speaking of pay, here's a good little tidbit right here. At the start of the pandemic, Live Nation's CEO, Michael Rapino, said that he was going to be giving up his salary in deference to the devastating impact of the pandemic on the music industry. Well, that only lasted about 2 months. And then he went on to still make $1.89 million in 2020. So that's their CEO, the chairman of Live Nation Entertainment, which is like the conglomerate that also includes the Ticketmaster side, is a guy named Greg Maffei. And he's also the president of a company called Liberty Media, which is a mass media company that has a 33% stake in Live Nation. By the way, the Saudi royal family has a 5.7% stake in Live Nation themselves. They invested $500 million in the company back in February. And maybe they came on board as like crowd management advisors or something. I don't know. But Maffei is also the chairman. This is the chairman of Live Nation. He's also the chairman of Sirius XM and TripAdvisor. This is good. He's a former chief financial officer of Oracle and Microsoft. And he also donated $250,000 to Donald Trump's inauguration committee. So these are the fucking freaks and sickos who are sitting at the top of this organization. And to them, this is a business like any other, you know? It just also happens to be an industry that brings a lot of people a lot of joy and allows artists to get paid for their creative output. And they're here to, squeeze every little bit of capital that they can get out of it, like the fucking vampires they are, until they've sucked the joy right out of it, and to the detriment of the artists and to the detriment of the fans and everyone else involved. Sometimes they also kill people while they're doing it, and they largely get away with it. And sometimes they have to pay a fine, but I guess they've done the math and determined that paying the fine every now and then is cheaper than actually taking the steps necessary to improve crowd safety. And nobody's making them do it, so why bother? And until they're held accountable, there's nothing preventing these future tragedies. There's nothing preventing this kind of stuff from happening again. I guess that's all I got. In summary, fuck Live Nation. I love you all. I would like to do more solo episodes like this periodically, so stay tuned for that, I guess. Good night, folks. That's it.